Hey, econ students, let's talk about inflation. Well, when we look at inflation, what are the causes and effects of inflation? Inflation is caused by the growth of the money supply, changes in aggregate demand, changes in aggregate supply. And the effects of inflation include decreasing the purchasing power a person has, eroding in income, and decrease in interest rates. So let's talk about the effects of rising prices. Inflation is a general increase in prices across an economy. And over the years, prices generally go up. Inflation shrinks the value of purchasing power, or purchasing power of things, shrinking the value, how far your money can go. The effects of inflation over the years can be seen in this comparison of prices from basic food items over here. We look at March 1996 versus March 2008, and this is a U.S. city average. So bread, a loaf of white bread, 85 cents in 1996. 2008, it was up to $1.35, and it's higher than that now. Eggs, a large dozen of eggs, $1.14. 2.20. It continues to climb. Milk. Okay, so a gallon of whole milk, $2.54, up to $3.78. And as you can see, each time, as time's gone on, prices have gone up. Another thing we need to discuss when we're talking about inflation is price indexes. To measure inflation, economists compare price levels, and to help them calculate price levels, economists use a price index, which is simply a measurement that shows how the average price of a standard group of goods changes over time. So you're comparing similar goods. Price indexes help consumers and business people make economic decisions, and the government also uses indexes in making policy decisions. So these indexes have a much bigger impact than just looking at prices from today versus 10 years ago for the same item. So a consumer price index, and this is the best known index that's out there. We call it CPI. It's totally focused on consumers. So the CPI is determined by measuring the price of a standard group meant to represent the market basket of a typical urban consumer, the everyday purchaser. And the market basket, which you can see to the right, is divided into 8 categories of goods and services. And we look at those, we have food and drinks, and we're going to include things like cereals, coffee, chicken, milk, eating at restaurants. Then we look at housing, and we have to look at rents, and we have to look at homeowners' costs and fuel. And then we have apparel and upkeep, so that's your clothes and jewelry. Then we have transportation, which is your airfares, new and used car purchases, gasoline, auto insurance. We got medical care, dealing with your prescriptions, eye care, the services that you get when you go to a physician, the emergency room, etc. Entertainment is things like newspapers, magazines, toys, musical instruments. Education and communication, so those things are your tuition, the postage you pay to mail a letter, a telephone bill, whether it's your cell phone or landline, and of course computers with internet. Other goods and services are things like your haircuts, your cosmetics, some fees that are charged by the bank. So these are the 8 categories that we divide CPI into. About every 10 years, the items in the market basket are updated to account for shifting consumer buying habits, because we don't buy the same items that we bought 10 years ago. We most certainly don't buy the same items we bought 20, 30, 40, or gosh, think about it, 100 years ago. They have to update the CPI to fit the current consumer market. Economists also find it useful to calculate the inflation rate, and that's the percentage rate of change in price level over time. Okay, so we want to know how much those prices are going up or how much those prices are going down, usually up. So to determine CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics established a base period to which you can compare prices. So right now our base period is 1982 to 1984, and the BLS determines the CPI for a given year using the formula that you see in front of you, which is CPI equals updated cost divided by the base period cost times 100. So the value that's found here is the cost between 1982 and 1984. And this is today's basket cost. So there's some various types of inflation, and with inflation rates in the United States have changed greatly over time, as you can tell from the graphic to the side. When the inflation rate exceeds 5%, it makes economic planning extremely difficult. That's something we consider to be high inflation. The worst kind of inflation is hyperinflation. Hyper, like someone that has way too much energy, hyperinflation, in which inflation rates can go as high as 100% or even 500% per month. And this is a vast, vast increase in inflation. So when we look at this is in what years was inflation so high that it made economic planning difficult? Well, obviously we come any time, like we said, it exceeds 5%. So if we drew a line right across here, okay, you can see that 1974, even up to 1978, all the way in 1982, that whole area, so from 1974 to 1982, it was above that 5% range, so it was difficult to plan then. And then if we pop over here, it's right above 5% in 1990. And then right here, if you look with the recession, this big drop of inflation, that big drop of inflation can also target a symbol that would represent what's going on with unemployment. Inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship. So if inflation is dropping at a steady rate, that means that you have unemployment growing at a steady rate. Well, there's a few causes of inflation. So what are the three causes of inflation? We have growth of the money supply, and that means there's too much money in the economy, which causes inflation. This is where the government is continuing to spend money. Interest rates are lower, where people can borrow more money. Also, when interest rates and inflation are lower, people have more purchasing power, so their money goes further. As inflation continues to rise, it will pull interest rates up, and that's a natural slowdown for the economy. But there is a point, normally at the peak of that business cycle, that top peak, following the expansionary period, where inflation is at its highest point. Changes in aggregate demand can cause inflation. So inflation can occur when demand for goods and services exceeds existing supply. Remember, that's something almost like a shortage. So demand for a good or service is much higher than what's available. Then there's changes in aggregate supply, and inflation can occur when producers raise prices in order to meet increased costs. So the cost of production has gone up for some reason, whether it's a resource, whether it's wages, whether it's rent. And so they have to increase their prices to cover that cost. So again, that's going to increase the price of the item. Wage increases are the largest single production cost for most companies. So what they're paying their employees. Even though they could have a lot of employees that are making minimum wage or a little higher, it's still going to be, no matter what, the biggest expense that they have when it comes to production. Then we have the wage price spiral. And this concept shows that increasing wages can lead to a spiral of even higher prices, because one increase in cost leads to an increase in prices, which leads to another increase in cost, and on and on and on and on and on, and whoop, by the time you get done, you're dizzy. So when we look down here, there's an example. Amgro fertilizer employees win a wage increase. Okay, they negotiated a wage increase, so they get paid more, which means their paychecks are bigger, which now means they can go buy more stuff. So when we come over here, the fact that these people are able to buy more stuff increases demand. Well, the wage increase then leads Amgro to raise the price of its products. So to pay for its employees' wages, they've raised the price of their product. Then, the rising cost of Amgro products leads to a rising cost for farmers. So now farmers have to pay more. So then that means farmers have to charge more for their product. So in response to that rising cost, farmers raise the prices of their products. Then that raises food costs for everybody and leads to employees demanding higher wages to cover the higher cost of food. This goes back to the minimum wage debate. Do we raise minimum wage or do we not? Depending on a healthy level, we can raise minimum wage. But to think that we're going to pay everybody $15 for minimum wage will then in turn create this wage price spiral. It'll only be a matter of time before $15 an hour isn't even enough to live off of. So there's some effects of inflation. So high inflation is a major economic problem. Major problem, and it affects your purchasing power, income, and interest rates. Inflation can erode your purchasing power. Well, what does that mean? As inflation goes up, your money's worth less and less. It buys less stuff. If the inflation rate is 10%, $1 will buy the equivalent of only 90 cents of a good. 10% of that dollar is in inflation. So really, you're only spending 90 cents of that dollar. And then we look over here. It says instead of a cross-country vacation to see the Grand Canyon, your family takes some day trips. Due to higher prices caused by inflation, your family cannot afford to travel across the country to the Grand Canyon. So you settle for those lower cost trips, the closer ones. You ask your boss if you can work extra hours at your part-time job. Cool. You need the money because inflation has reduced the purchasing power of your paycheck. Not cool. So your money's not going as far as it was before, and you need to work more hours to get more money to buy the same things that you bought before. Effects of income. Inflation sometimes, but not always, erodes income. If workers' wages do not increase as much as inflation does, they are in a worse economic position than before. And people living on fixed income, like retired people, are hit especially hard by inflation because their money, their income does not increase, even as prices increase. So they're still set on the same budget that they have before. So effects of interest rates. So people receive a given amount of interest on money that they keep in their savings account. But their true return depends on the rate of inflation. If inflation rate is higher than the bank's interest rate, you're going to end up actually losing money. Go figure. You thought it was safe in a savings account. If we look at this graphic over here, we see wages down here in this elevator, right? And we see the bellhop, and we says up here cost of living, and he says going up, which means cost of living is going up, but wages are staying down here. Recent trends. Americans under the age of 30 have experienced fairly low inflation rates for most of their lifetime. In the 2000s, the economy actually seemed to be experiencing a period of deflation or a sustained drop in the price level. However, by mid-2008, inflation was becoming a worry. CPI rose to 1.1% in June. Higher production costs fueled by a 6.6% increase in energy prices helped push the annual inflation rate to more than 4%. And remember, this was the peak right before the Great Recession. So now we need to wrap it up. In a nutshell, the facts. Over the years, the prices of goods and services have generally gone up. The government uses price indexes to measure changes in the price from year to year. Economists have several theories about the causes of inflation relating to growth of the money supply, changes in aggregate demand, and changes in aggregate supply. Inflation affects purchasing power, income, and personal savings. So what's the generalization of all this? Inflation, a general increase in prices across the economy, affects purchasing power, income, and savings. Economists have several theories about the causes of inflation. The government uses price indexes to measure inflation. And that is all I have for you on inflation.